Hello, I'm Dr. Steve Dudley with Perfectus Livestock Solutions, and we're here today with Dr. Andrew Bents with Alltech. And I'll let Dr. Bents introduce himself, but Dr. Bents initially worked with our group with Vet Med Center Prairie Livestock out of veterinary school until he made a change and went back to the farm. But Dr. Bents, thanks for being here and agreeing to talk and maybe introduce yourself and what you're doing today.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. It's great to be here and great to be back meeting with you today. So, yeah, I guess just a little more background. So, like Dr. Dudley said, I was right out of school, came here and learned a lot about veterinary medicine and particularly on the swine side. And from there, I kind of my job diverged a little bit and took on the family operation. So I'd be the fifth generation owner and operator of our fair to finish operation just outside of Worthington here. I also work as senior swine technical veterinarian for Alltech.
Excellent. Well, what we wanted to talk about today is Dr. Bents is presenting at the American Association of Swine Veterinarians in Las Vegas and has done some work with mycotoxins. So we're here to talk a little bit about mycotoxins. So tell us a little bit about what you and your team have found.
Yeah. So when I first started with the team, mycotoxins were something that were a little bit of an abstract concept. You know, through veterinary school, they don't teach us a lot about mycotoxins. In the field, you know, I'd heard some. With the team, I was fortunate to be able to join a team that does a great deal of work understanding mycotoxins, doing in vivo and in vitro work, understanding the impacts of mycotoxins on animal health. As part of that, it's kind of a two-piece strategy that or actually a three-piece strategy that we've employed. The first part is doing an annual harvest analysis. So we'll actually collect corn and feed samples from around the United States every harvest and evaluate what the mycotoxin loads are in the harvest, so we know what regional challenges we might be faced with in the coming year as that stored corn goes into the feed. The second part is actually doing an evaluation of those grains through what we call a 37+ analysis. So we're evaluating, it's probably over 54 different types of mycotoxins at this point. There's some in particular that we're especially interested in, but there's a number that we're trying to continually to evaluate on their emerging amounts that are showing up in the evaluation. And then the third part is actually developing different mycotoxin strategies and binding strategies to try to account for those mycotoxins that we're finding in the grain samples that we've collected.
Yeah. And so every year your team's going out and analyzing the testing, doing stuff through your lab. As producers are wanting to do testing on their own, is that something they contact you, or what other labs are able to do mycotoxin testing?
Yeah, there's a number of labs that can do testing, and then again, it's how robust the testing you want to see. You know, there's some labs that are only evaluating for a couple different mycotoxins. There's some that are looking for a more robust amount of mycotoxins in the field. Besides our lab, again, we have a lab in Brookings, so it's really conveniently located here from Worthington to do the testing there. But again, I think MVTL, Dairyland Labs. I mean, there's a lot of third-party labs that you can verify those responses in if you want a third-party evaluation of mycotoxin loads as well.
Sure. Okay. So what have you seen in 2025 harvest season with mycotoxins?
So a bit of a winding road here for you. I'll lead you down. But with the increased pressure from rust, from black tar spots, we decided to budget for a lot more testing this year. We wanted to see if the fungal pressure on this year's crop would have any impact on mycotoxins. So we actually bumped up. We took quite a few more samples this year than even that we've done in the past. It was very interesting. Again, it's always regional. Some years one region is good and another region might be more challenged, and then the next year might be flip-flopped. Again, had a really great crop, really favorable growing conditions. What's good for the grains is good for the other things that grow with those grains too. So that's part of the concern there. On top of that, because of the current state of pricing, and because of the weather conditions in the fall, a good amount of crop was put straight into the bin without any drying, without any further conditioning on that crop. So those were a few concerns that we had going into the season. So we took a number of samples from all over the country, East Coast, West Coast, a lot in the Midwest, trying to focus where our customers are growing grains to feed to their livestock. Again, there was some regionality to it, but in this area we did see high levels of mycotoxins show up. And so that is a concern. We did see some pockets of good, but again, if we are purchasing corn or on the market, we don't know if we've got that good crop or that not so good crop.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, to further the challenge, the mycotoxins or the molds that we're concerned with, that's going to be like the Fusarium, the Aspergillus penicillium molds. Some grow better in the field, some grow better in the bins, and so with the variable weather conditions that we've had this winter, kind of some of the warmer conditions, there's been some concern that some of those storage molds, especially if that was put into the bin without any conditioning, without any drying, without any heating, we may see an increase in some of that mold growth and then some of that subsequent mycotoxin growth. Just to review, a mold can be killed with heat, but the mycotoxin will persist with or without the heat. So the mycotoxin will persist. And on top of that, the mycotoxin is on the seed coat of the grain. And so as we go into ethanol production, that mycotoxin that's on the seed coat will get concentrated 3-4 times whatever the level was. So as we're feeding distillers grains into our livestock, we're seeing a greatly amplified effect of that mycotoxin level. Again, the mycotoxin isn't destroyed through the distilling process. So we see an increased pressure of those mycotoxins in the distillers grains that are being fed to the animals as well.
I appreciated your comment on pre-harvest versus post-harvest, because I think producers do get confused on, once you've put it in the bin, how concerned do you have to be? And if you tested it pre-harvest, do you have to test it again post-harvest? When months later as you start to pull it out of the bin.
Right, and I would say yes. Based on the findings that we're getting, I would say yes. If you are feeding your own corn, I think it would be well worth testing that corn as it goes into the bin, just so you know where your baseline is at. And if we have a nice warm winter, or if as you pull that off, you're seeing that moisture. I've heard of some higher moisture corn coming off of some of the bins. It was maybe put in at 15%. We're seeing it maybe up to 17% over the winter here. And so those types of storage conditions, I'm encouraging, hey, let's take another sample. Let's see where our corn's at. Because if you're stuck with a bin full of mold and mycotoxin, and that's your sole source of corn for your livestock, you want to make sure you've got a strategy to address that. But again, if you're purchasing it, you don't know where it's at, so you kind of set your baseline as the least common denominator of what's present in the industry. Another piece I'd like to add, I guess I forgot to mention earlier as well, a question that comes in a lot is the use of fungicides on the field. And so some folks thought that there was a lot of discussion on fungicide use in this year's crop to try to address the rusts and tar spots. And so we actually did a study looking at, so there was a customer that was doing a fungicide study within the field, where they were applying fungicide part of the field and not applying it to the other to see what kind of yield difference they got. And the portion of the field that had the fungicide applied to did have very favorable results on the crop production in that portion of the field. However, when we did our mycotoxin analysis on that same grain that came off of the fungicide treated versus untreated portions of the field, we actually found higher mycotoxin levels on the fungicide portion of the field. So we can't, we've done this study before. This is just another replicate of the same project, that we're not seeing a correlation between the use of fungicide and the ability to inhibit that mold growth that's going to cause challenges for our livestock as they consume that feed. So.
Interesting. So as producers are out there thinking about, okay, I'm raising my own corn, I want to test it pre-harvest or as I'm putting it in the bin, how many tests are appropriate over how many acres, or do you have a rule of thumb of what you recommend?
Yeah, it's tough because you could get that hot pocket that gets in there. That we know it as we're combining, we see the yield go up, we see the yield go down, and if we can grab some of those areas where the corn has been stressed, if we had a heat stress event or if we had a stress portion of the field, I think those are good areas to grab, because that's going to be what's going to contribute more to the challenge, especially as it goes into storage. Again, the best sample is a scatter throughout. So if there's any way that we can grab multiple samples throughout the bin, or as we're filling the bin, take a few samples as we fill that bin up, especially if you're coming from multiple fields going into that bin or into that storage area. It's good to kind of have multiple captures, so we know what the average is of the corn that we have on storage.
do you think it would be appropriate to say every 160 acres is one test, or again, one test, as you said,
Hmm.
if you find it, it's relevant. If you
Hmm.
don't find it, it's you may still have a problem. You just
Yep.
didn't detect it.
Yeah.
So that's always, I think, a challenge for people to have a rule of thumb of I'm going to send in 2 tests, 3 tests.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a composite for every 80 to 160, for every plot that you have, I think a composite of 5 to 10 samples within that field, I think would be a good strategy to employ.
Let's maybe dive into the different kinds of mycotoxins that are
Mhm.
out there. So there's different kinds
Mhm.
produced by different kinds of molds.
Mhm.
But you want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, so there are 3 that primarily concern me from a veterinary perspective. And so the 3 that I'm following the closest are going to be DON, which is vomitoxin, zearalenone, and fumonisin. So those are the 3 that I would say I see the most challenge develop in the field. So DON, or again, the vomitoxin, again, the most obvious is feed refusal, actual vomiting if you have high enough levels of the toxin in the feed. But then as we dive in deeper, there's been a great deal of work that's actually looked at different titrations of DON, so different levels of DON in the feed and their impact on immunity. And so a study just 4 years ago in 2022 actually looked at high levels of DON in the feed, and the animals were also given a modified live PRRS vaccine. So going back to the swine side. And as we got to the high end of the levels of DON within the feed, which is over 750 parts per billion, we actually saw complete or almost complete immunosuppression. And so we didn't really get a vaccine response. And again, that interested me because, again, is there something nutritionally that we can do to help the immune response of these vaccines that we're spending, putting in, it's taking time, taking dollars to put into the animals.
Right. So vomitoxin, again, and there's different sizes. We're going to get to mitigation strategies, but each mycotoxin is kind of at a different size and a different, takes different things to bind them up. But
Correct.
Don would be vomitoxin, the first one, and then zearalenone.
Yeah, so zearalenone I'd say is number 2. That's been a peak interest, especially if you have breeding stock. So zearalenone is going to produce estrogen-like effects on the animals. So again, the classic response is looking for swollen vulvas. If we've got cattle, we might see a little more riding in the pens. Where I've really seen an impact is especially in late-term pregnant sows. I've worked up a few cases where as we got to the last 2-3 weeks of pregnancy, we started to see aborts increase. We've always talked about seasonal aborts, and may or may not be correlated with a PRRS virus. So we've done a bunch of work, or a great deal of work, looking at these late stage aborts when they were negative for PRRS, negative for lepto. Trying to work through the different rule outs. So infectious rule outs that might be causing these late term aborts. Come back and test the feed, and we end up finding higher levels of zearalenone than we'd like to find. And zearalenone is definitely another mycotoxin that we're seeing in high levels. Get to eastern Minnesota, and we're seeing 8 to 10x levels of the high end range that we'd want to be feeding to our breeding stock. So,
and how would that compare with prior years? So 8 to 10 higher this year.
I would say this year has been worse. This year's been worse.
Yeah.
And another word of caution is especially for folks that have sows outdoors. The zearalenone can be present in the bedding if you're using corn stalk bedding. It can be present in the feed. And again, we'll circle back to it, but a mitigant in the feed can help with a challenge in the bedding, but don't overlook the bedding as a potential source for mycotoxin ingestion as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. We had a cattle producer in South Dakota a couple years ago, and again, cattle, he was feeding and bedding with corn stalks, and a number of abortions and problems, and all the infectious agents were negative. So then we finally tested corn stalks, and they were extremely high with zearalenone. So yeah, it's a good reminder.
The third that I've been watching, I'd say in order of severity, would be fumonisin. Again, fumonisin does have some, not as severe as DON, but can have some immunosuppressive effects as well. So again, if we're not seeing that response to treatment, not seeing that response, not seeing an antibiotic, or not seeing the response to our vaccinations, that may be another mycotoxin worth looking into. Another component with fumonisin that I'm really tracking is in some higher levels of fumonisin, we're actually seeing interstitial edema, or edema in the lungs. And so you cut open an animal that's died of respiratory distress. You see the edema on the lungs. It's what I would classically call a PERS-looking lung, but the lungs come back PERS negative. Again, that interstitial edema can be attributed to the higher levels of fumonisin in the feed as well. So,
it's parts per billion, so I think that was the message that we want people to think about.
Yeah,
which is an extremely small amount of material. So
yeah, to put it into perspective, a lot of the distillers grains that I've been testing for Don, we've been seeing it coming in. I've been getting reports of, they've been telling me 1.5, 4.5, 5.5. Well, that's parts per million. So that translates to 1,500, 4,500, 5,500 parts per billion, whereas 750 is the high end where we start to be concerned about immunosuppressive and other physiological effects on the animals. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got one of my swine producers right now that's running a feed trial, and his feed trial, he feels like pigs are stalling out at the end of the feeding period, and one group he's using distillers and the other he's using whole corn. And where the distillers his initial impression is he thinks he's getting some stalling that's occurring. So to be determined, but
I would, from my own personal experience, I would anticipate that being the case. So.
Yeah. Well, let's transition to maybe talking about the mitigants, or what producers, you got corn, you're going to feed that corn if it's your own, and so we got to look for strategies to be able to do it.
Yep.
So let's maybe explain to people the different kinds of mitigants and what tools are out there.
Yeah. So I kind of look at three general categories of mitigants that are out there. There's a lot of different products, and in general, we can kind of fall into three. We've got our clay binders. That's just a non-specific binder. Like you alluded to before, doesn't do as good of a job on our Dons, on some of our fumonisin, on some of our big mycotoxins that we're concerned about today. But it's a very low cost, very non-specific binder. The challenge with that is we can have binding with other vitamins and nutrients present in the feed as well. So what you save on a clay, you may be having to spend by either losing the nutritional profile or having to increase those nutrients to offset the non-specific binding. The second is going to be like products like a sodium metabisulfate. Again, a really nice product. Kind of the way I think about that is it doesn't so much bind the mycotoxins to prevent them from causing a physiological effect. It more overrides the flavor, the off-putting flavor, and so you won't see the reduced intake, but we may still have some of the mycotoxin effect on the animals. And then the third would be the complex carbohydrate structures that you can get from a yeast cell wall. And so the man-enriched oligosaccharides, the yeast cell wall component, that is going to be a more specific binding property, and you're not going to have the nutritional deficits that develop as a result of that specific binding. And those have been more effective against some of these Dons and some of these mycotoxins we've talked about.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. When people are looking for a mycotoxin binder, we want it to be specific. So you mentioned, so it doesn't tie up vitamins, nutrients, and other things. And I think that's really important. We want it to have a good return on investment, So it doesn't matter what it costs per se, but we do want it to have a good return on investment. And then, being able to easily add into the feed. And then good absorption.
Yep.
So those are all things that people want to think about.
Another challenge is in some of these really high levels of mycotoxins, we've actually had to do some blends. For example, some of the yeast cell wall products do a great job binding the toxins from actually getting in and causing physiological effects on the animals. But again, if it's high levels of mycotoxin, it's still going to have an off-putting taste. And so we've even evaluated doing a blend of a yeast cell wall, maybe with a sodium metabisulfate in some of these extreme cases, so the animals will eat it, but also not be affected by the mycotoxins present in the feed. So in some extreme cases, you may have to do a blend even to try to overcome the high levels that we have present.
Right. How are mycotoxin binders impacted by pelleting or extrusion or processing and storage?
Yeah, no, great questions. Again, like any nutrient, a long storage, a long shelf life can deteriorate their efficacy. And so, if we're sitting on them for a long time, if we have our own mill, we want to make sure we're keeping those products fairly fresh. So you get your good binding effect that you want to see. On the pelleting and extrusion process, we have not seen any negative effects of the pelleting or extrusion process using some of the yeast cell wall products. Again, the clays are fairly inert, but again, the work that we've done, we very regularly utilize the yeast cell wall products in our own pelleted products,
Right.
and don't see a negative effect of that. So.
Okay. Well, obviously, Alltech sells some mycotoxin binders. Maybe talk about your specific products that that you recommend, and maybe if you'd address swine producers, grow finish versus swine or sow herds, if there's a difference.
Yeah.
And then I'll maybe ask you about cattle too.
Perfect. So the two main ones that I've been working with most are Integral A Plus and Integral M. We do have an MLR, which is going to be kind of a lower intensity one, but for this year, for the futures prices that we're seeing with the animals and the negative effects that we're seeing, I've been reaching for either the Integral A Plus or the Integral M. Again, I get that question a lot. What is the difference? Ultimately, Integral A Plus is kind of the broad spectrum. It's going to cover all species. So if we have a feed mill that's feeding multiple species, they like to have the A Plus on hand because they can use it for the cattle, they can use it for the sheep, they can use it for the pigs, they can use it for the poultry. It works really nice. The A Plus does have some additional algae products in it, which give additional binding effects that the rumen won't break down. So you actually get that binding effect that goes into the intestinal tract as well. And so A Plus has been a really good one for ruminants. If you are just feeding monogastric, so if you just have pigs or poultry, the M has all of the benefits of the yeast cell wall product. It just doesn't have the algae product in it as well. So it's going to be a little bit lower cost, but it's going to be more specific to your monogastrics, Integral M for monogastric. And so, if you want to have a cost savings, that would be a way to do it. But again, if you're working with a toll mill that probably just wants to have an A Plus on hand, that's going to be the easier route to go. Again, some other things to look for, in the farm, for some of these mycotoxin challenges. I've gotten to a point where if I see ear tip necrosis, if we feel like our ventilation is relatively under control, I've kind of made it a standard practice to add a mycotoxin binder into the feed, especially in the nursery as we're seeing these ear tip necrosis challenges. The phomonicins especially can cause some vasculitis and poor blood flow to the extremities, and so that's another portion that I'm looking for. Again, conception rate challenges, late term aborts in our sow herds, off feed events, mass off feed events, and again, poor response. I mean, if you're used to pick your disease that you're fighting, PRRS, flu, parasuis, Pasteurella strep. I mean, if you're having these challenges and they're just not responding like they used to, there may be an immunosuppressive effect at play too that you may want to dig into deeper on the feed side. So.
Yeah. Well, are there other things that you think from swine or poultry producers that we need to think about or additionally talk about?
Yeah, my big suggestion with the mycotoxin results that we've seen on our harvest analysis is I've been very aggressive running kind of the higher end of where we'd want to be for mycotoxin binding in all my sow diets, in all the nursery diets, our more sensitive animals. In some instances, especially for moving animals from a nursery to a finisher, I am running some mycotoxin binding in that first couple diets in the finisher as well, just to help with that transition and take one more stress off the plate for those animals as they transition from the nursery to the finisher. And again, the amount of binder that you add may be relative to the amount of distillers that you're using. Again, distillers will, that's a concentration of the seed coat. So if your corn is at this level, it's going to be 3-4 times that concentration when you get to the final distillers product. So,
yeah. Could you maybe comment in rule of thumbs as far as volume that people are going to be adding per ton, and then cost per ton that would be?
Yeah, volume per ton. So again, the Integral A Plus is the most common one that's used. What we use as a rule of thumb is 2 pounds is kind of the maintenance rate. Things are good. we don't think there's a mycotoxin challenge, but we just want to cover for things. If we know that there's a challenge, if we know that we have a problem, or if we're at a concern, we're running that at 4 pounds per ton.
Okay.
Cost, we're looking at a couple bucks a pound. I mean, so there's a cost.
$5 to $10 a
Yep.
ton.
Yep. I mean, so there's a cost, but again, as we look at the negative effects on the animals, we want to make sure we weigh that anytime we add an intervention. So.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe switch over to cattle just a little bit and talk about some of if your company's seen some challenges with cattle operations or what's been happening there.
Yeah. So I'll preface, I don't do as much cattle work as I used to. I'm kind of, my focus has been on the swine side, but I just on the cattle side, again, as we talk about DON, and as we're looking at the levels that we're finding in the distillers, high levels of DON can disrupt the rumen microbiome, and that can result in higher levels of bloat, higher enteric challenge. And so if that's a challenge we're seeing, it may be worth looking into the feedstuffs to see if there's a high level of DON that maybe needs to be addressed for those animals. High value animals, we don't want to be losing an animal to a bloat that could have been avoided. And then same on the zearalenone, again, the estrogenic effects. We can see a lot of pen riding both in the steers and in the heifers. Again, we had a case where the zearalenone levels were high enough in the feedlot. They were feeding MGH to the heifers to suppress riding in the lot, and actually the estrogen levels from the zearalenone were overriding the MGH, and we were seeing riding despite feeding the MGH in the lot. So if you're seeing riding, even though you're doing something to intervene with that the zearalenone piece may be something to look into as well.
No, I think that's really important. I think in the cattle industry, distillers has been such a good product. Mm-hmm. It's bringing in different amino acids, which is something that we're really talking about with our Perfectus livestock feeds. Mm-hmm. And so there's probably a more compelling reason to be feeding distillers to our ruminants than swine. We do know that ruminants are less impacted by mycotoxins than monogastrics, so swine and poultry. But as you indicated, when they get high enough levels, it can definitely be a problem.
Yep.
So, bedding, corn stalks, we kind of chatted a little bit about that, and zearalenone and overriding any of that. The MGA products can really be interfered with if you've got some of that going on.
Yep.
Well, excellent. Anything else you want to add or comment on before we wrap it up?
I think we've been very thorough in covering this topic. Again, it was this was in the presentation that I gave at the AASV conference as well. But again, if you want to learn more about the harvest analysis or any of the work that we're doing, you can reach out to the Alltech website or can reach out to any Alltech representative to learn more about the process as well.
So. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think many different companies and different veterinarians, we all get focused in a certain area and with things that have impacted us. So you want to reach out to people that are doing it a lot.
That's right.
Well, on behalf of Perfectus Livestock Solutions, we thank you for attending our webinar podcast. And if you have questions with mycotoxins, reach out to our team at Perfectus Livestock Solutions. Okay, well, thanks for listening to our podcast with Perfectus Livestock Solutions. If you liked what you heard, please share or give us a like. And thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.